Thank you very much for this warm welcome. And I would like you to notice in the picture where I stand, I am at the Ghetto Fighters Museum because I was working here all day. But the Ghetto Fighters Museum hosts the glass booth in which Eichmann was sitting during his trial. They received it from the Israeli police at the time because due to their great help in preparing the trial, and I'm sitting within the glass booth, so I cannot give you a better background of where I am and a better background for my lecture than this booth, which you can see here. It's really a glass booth, and the idea behind it was that maybe, God forbid, somebody would like to kill Eichmann, to murder Eichmann during the trial. So they built up a booth with very strong glass, so nobody could take Eichmann's life and Israel could handle the trial as expected. I will now move to the presentation, and I will tell you how it's built in a second. Just let me share it with you. As you can see, I'm going 60 years. It's really 60 years. It's already, in addition to this historical day of the many years following the Kristallnacht, just a couple of words about my family. My parents were born in the then Republic of Czechoslovakia, a very strong democracy between the two world wars. And my mother is a survivor from Auschwitz. She's still alive, although she is 106 years old, but she is in a great shape. She lost many parts of her family, her first husband, her parents, her sister, but she never gave up on her choice to keep up living, and she finished her medical studies. She was a doctor, and she's still with us here, and I'm very happy. And I always, when I start lecturing, I say that I'm her daughter, and I celebrate life through my lectures to her heritage. I somehow don't seem to be able to move on with my presentation. I don't know why. Maybe I'll stop sharing, Christian. I don't know. I can't move.
Maybe if you try to click.
To click? No? Oh, yes. Okay. Never did that before. I would like to start with this V-Day as opposed to liberation. V-Day is actually what happened not to the Jews, but to the other nations or countries who fought Germany in Second World War. And V-Day is like 8/9 of May 1945. V is for the word victory. Liberation is a completely different story. I would like to start with this because in order to understand the profound impact that the Eichmann trial left, somebody should need to know a little bit what happened in the trials of Nazi criminals before the Eichmann trial, immediately after the war. And I refer mainly to the big trial of Nuremberg, the trial of the major war crimes, which started on October 1945 and ended in October of 1946. The reason that this trial were held in Nuremberg was that Nuremberg was the only city where there was a whole hall of justice still not destroyed. But this is less important to us. At the Nuremberg trial, actually, the Jewish Holocaust, I might call it sometimes Shoah because I forget that I'm not speaking to my native Hebrew speakers. Shoah is the word we use to mark the Holocaust. The Jewish Holocaust was really a very marginal, peripheral issue at the Nuremberg trial. One of the reasons for that was the fact that really it took only a few months to prepare the trial, and the allies who conducted the trial, the Russians, the French, the British, and the Americans, did not have a lot of material to understand the very unique character of this event, in addition to the fact that Jackson, who was the American prosecutor, was opposed very much to testimonies. So he didn't allow, in the American part of the trial, which was the major participation, he didn't allow Jewish witnesses to testify to what they've been through. And he said, and this is marked in the research, he said that the Jews tend to exaggerate things that happen to them, and he doesn't want them to testify about what happened during Second World War. And anyway, there are more important issues at the trial. So at the Nuremberg trial, the Jewish matter of the Holocaust was really very, very peripheral and marginal. So you can see what is the difference. And the second reason for that is that there is a real profound difference between Holocaust and World War II. First of all, we don't have a specific date to mark when the Jewish Holocaust ended. Actually, after liberation, there are about 30,000 Jews who died only on the first day after liberation from eating. Are they still in the Holocaust? It's a big question. But I think they do, because they are still victims of what happened at that time. So we don't have a specific date to when the Shoah and the Holocaust was ending. Unlike Second World War, which ended, some countries mark the 8th of May, some countries mark the 9th of May. Then the outcome of the Shoah. The outcome of the Shoah is a complete, basic, profound destruction of both the Jewish people and their civilization. These were wiped up from the face of the earth. I have to give you a little bit of numbers. Before Second World War, there were about 19 million Jews on the face of the earth. Today, we cannot make up biologically to what happened. Today, the Jewish people number the optimistic people say they number 12 million at all in the world. They make a lot of noise, but that's the numbers. On the other hand, the Allies actually had V-Day. They had victory. They had the victory happiness, the victory joy. And that's the future. The Shoah is still a scar in the souls of the Jewish people. Each and every one of them, many of them, are like me. It's in their family's history. In my working study, I have pictures of all those parts of the family who have perished and been murdered during the Holocaust. So it's an open wound. It doesn't mean that we don't live. We live and we have good life, but it's an open wound. It happened only 80 years ago. The Jewish people did not recover, both demographically and evolutionary, to this day. Of course, Europe basically had a huge rehabilitation, a huge growth after Second World War, and I'm not speaking about the Americans who had a real boom after Second World War. So basically, at the Nuremberg trial, the story of the Jews did not come into accentuate because many reasons, but this is a fact and it's very important. It gives you a perspective, a context to understand what will happen later at the Eichmann trial. Now, I want to refer to you to this. This is basically the epistemological timeline of my lecture. Epistemologically, we have 3 stages of consuming an event, an historical event, especially such a major event as the Holocaust. The first stage is the stage of information. Information does not mean knowledge. You can have a lot of information coming to you, but still you don't comprehend the essence and the borders of the event you're dealing with. And information keeps coming all the years, basically. Even from 1944, we have already information of what's going on. But the information does not tell us that there has been a plot of a final solution against the Jews. And we don't really know what Auschwitz means. People hear about Auschwitz. There's been a report by the 2 Jews who escaped Auschwitz, but people really don't understand the concept of industrialized murder. So information keeps coming in, but it's still not knowledge. At a certain point in time, which I will tell you why and when later on, this information is turned into knowledge, the real understanding of what the Holocaust was all about. And last but not least, at a certain stage, knowledge is transformed into awareness. Awareness is when you comprehend an event and you know in which way it affected your life, your way of thinking, your values, and your attitude towards life. I will show you all three stages, but bear in mind that sequence of the lecture goes from information to knowledge to awareness. Now, a historian will always tell you that you cannot deal with text without a context. So I will tell you all the time, the text and the context combined with each other. Now, let me give you the timeline of the context. The first timeline is 1943 to 1945, and this is a stage when the first knowledge and testimony of some who were able to escape comes to the knowledge of the Western world. It's to a large extent, it's ignored. You must bear in mind the context. Most of the European countries are involved in a war, in the World War, which is a very fierce war, and each and every one of them is worried about her or his problems. The Jewish problem is just another in a whole lot of a very turmoilic situation. So the early testimonies are 1943 to 1945, and they leave actually no impact. But they keep coming. I will just tell you one of those. The most dramatic, maybe in my eyes, is when one delegate, a Jewish delegate from Poland, succeeded to escape Poland, and he got to Britain, to London, and he tries to wake up the English people to what's going on in Poland. And just bear in mind that in Poland, before the Second World War, we had 3.5 million Jews. Of those on the land of Poland at the end of the war, there were only 80,000 Jews alive. And when they ignore him, he is committing suicide on the stairs of the British Parliament in order to awake the attention. Nothing really happened except that his name was Shmuel Ziegelboim, that Shmuel Ziegelboim died. Then came the Nuremberg trial. Now, I want to say something about the Nuremberg trial, beside the fact that there were no Jewish testimonies. So the story of the Holocaust at the Nuremberg trial was told basically through German documents. So for instance, the destruction or the resistance at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was described at the Nuremberg trial by the documents of General Stroop, who actually dismissed the revolution at the Warsaw Ghetto. And of course, he looked at the Jews as bandits, as terrorists, as we should talk to them about today, and hampering the activities of the German army. So at the Nuremberg trial, you did not hear about the plight of the Jews, what we call the Holocaust, from the mouth of the victims, but rather through the documents of the murderers. And this, of course, is a completely different story, which in a way postponed the Jewish story to a later time. Then came the establishment of the State of Israel, which of course changed the stand and the status of the Jewish people once they were sovereign in a country of their own. And in the framework of the establishment of the State of Israel, a mass immigration of Jews, mostly survivors from the Holocaust, immigrated to the newly born Jewish state. I hope you can grasp all this much information that I gave you and understand what's going on and what very strong context we are speaking about. Just one more remark. We have historical committees, which the Jews built up all over Europe, immediately after the war, collecting testimonies of survivors. This makes basically the first material with which we start the research of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, but this will come a little bit later. Now, the basic book, the textbook about the Shoah, the first textbook, maybe it's even the textbook until today, is Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews. Professor Raoul Hilberg, who was a huge, profound scholar, wrote his big textbook. When I got to the university, they told me you don't have to study anything, just read Raoul Hilberg's books. That told me my tutor and teacher, Yuda Bauer. Raoul Hilberg wrote his Destruction of the European Jews based only on German documents. He was one of the not the defense, one of the American staff who prepared the trial, and he saw many documents, and he wrote his PhD, his glorious fame, only based on German documents. You cannot, today it's absurd, you cannot think of writing the Holocaust without the Jewish testimony, but he wrote it only based on German documents. Nevertheless, it's a good book, but it's a change that should be noticed. This is one picture from the Nuremberg trial. We will not go into it, just to make you have a vision. Now, I want to read with you together the opening remarks of Jackson opening the trial. It is very important because later on we will go to read the opening remarks of Gideon Hausner, the attorney who opened the Eichmann trial. And I will show you the profound difference between the Nuremberg trial and its aims and the Eichmann trial and its aims. And so is the text of Jackson. May it please your honors, the privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, you know, France, Britain, America, and Russia, flushed with victory and stunned with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. I want to give you what is important in this text. The first one is that it speaks in universal terms, basically in human universal terms. This trial is educational trial. This trial is based and aimed at speaking to next generations. The second thing is the feeling, the basic feeling that the war that was so destructive with a very clear somebody to blame, with a very clear aggressive, should not pass by without, like other wars did before. It was the first international tribunal in history. And the third thing is that there is no victory euphoria. Actually, we need to prepare the world of tomorrow, and this should be built on justice. This should be built on honesty. This is very important because it's an international aim of the trial. Now, I want to show you one more thing. I want to show you in his opening remark how he treats the issue of the Jews. He says the following words. When we saw it the first time, we actually almost fainted. Of the 9,600,000 Jews who lived in Nazi-dominated Europe, 60% are authoritatively estimated to have perished. 5,700,000 Jews are missing. This is the term, missing. Today, nobody would say they are missing. They would say they are murdered, they were killed, they died, but they're not missing from the countries in which they formerly lived. over 4,500,000 cannot be accounted for by the normal death rate, etc., etc. Just to give you an illustration, the famous Wannsee Conference, nobody knew that such a conference took place. The protocol of the Wannsee Conference was discovered only by the late of 1947. Today, it's one of the most important documents about the Holocaust. So we live in a world where the first information is coming into light, but it's still a very missing, a very full of holes information. Now, a little bit about the power of judgment. This is also very important. There were three parts to the conviction. The first one is crimes against peace. The Americans thought this is the most important thing of the trial because the Germans, as they understood it, initiated violently a very violent war against the other nations. And Jackson, as you know, based his case only upon documentation, and he blamed the Germans, of course, in conspiracy to shake a war. He concentrated on this part, which is a very well-known article of international law, even before the Nuremberg trial. And you must remember that, like all Americans, Jackson was really speaking to the American public opinion, who never suffered from Second World War, and explaining to them why we did enter this war, which is so far away from our country. The second article was war crimes, and the novelty of the trial was crimes against humanity. Now, this is actually the contribution of the Nuremberg to the international law, but nobody really understood what is the difference between war crimes and crimes against humanity. I would like to say one word about crimes against humanity, which came actually into effect only 20, 25 years ago with Milosevic from Yugoslavia. Basically, it differs from war crimes because it speaks about humanitarian principles that were not coded into a law until the Nuremberg trial. It is actually a cultural statement. Crimes against humanity is a cultural statement going against the complete breakdown and ignoring of the civilizational rules of the game. And it's not always, basically, a side effect of a war. If we think about the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, there was no war there. It was a huge, massive killing without the reason of war. And of course, the Shoah. The Holocaust is not also, the Germans did not have a war with Germany. Actually, they were great German patriots. And once you have this introduction, I can go easily into the Eichmann trial. Before I go into it, you can see here at the bottom of this part of my presentation, the Nazi and collaborators punishment law. It took, this is a law that was enacted in Israel, and it was aimed first and foremost, this is very important for me to tell you and to accentuate to you. It was enacted in the Israeli parliament in 1950, and it was aimed mainly against Jews who were conceived as collaborators with Germans, namely the kapos. It's a generic term. The kapos included those who were in the Judenrats, those who were in the Jewish militia, those who were heads of blocks at the concentration camps, who were actually not collaborators because they didn't get any good something in return for their service. They were nominated, and if they said no, they would have been killed. But the Israeli lawmaker thought that this is something they should put into the law. And then, of course, they added the three crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And they also added a new kind of crime, crimes against Jews. these are the 4 parts, and this is the law by which Israel put Eichmann on trial. Eichmann, as a matter of fact, was basically the first non-Jew to put on trial according to the Nazi and Nazi collaborators punishment law. All the others, 35 of them, were Jews who were put on trial in Israel. Now, Israel abolished the death sentence in 1954, and Eichmann was the first to be sentenced to death, because once you're in the law, once you're convicted in the Nazi and Nazi collaborators punishment law, your punishment is death. There are 3 stages to the Eichmann trial. The first, 1960, Eichmann was captured in Argentina. I will spare to you the story. The information, by the way, about Eichmann whereabouts came from Fritz Bauer, who was the prosecutor of the Hessen state of Germany. He gave it as a secret to the Israelis, and he said that, I give you Eichmann, take him. It took 3 years after he brought the information until Eichmann was brought to Israel. And in 1961, from April until September, the trial went on. And then the judges took some time to decide the verdict. And then they, in December of 1961, they gave their verdict and later on their death sentence. At the beginning of the trial, Ben-Gurion was interviewed by Le Monde. This is a French paper. And he said, this will be the Nuremberg of the Jewish people. Now, this is a very interesting sentence. And it goes to the beginning of what we were speaking about. What did Ben-Gurion mean by this sentence? Actually, he did not explain. I am explaining to you Ben-Gurion now, and I think I do it with quite some knowledge to do so, to be so pertinent as to try and explain what Ben-Gurion meant. The first thing he said, it is that the Jewish case did not receive the justice it was entitled to. Not at the Nuremberg trial and not in all the other trials that happened in different countries, the national trials, as we call them. The second thing is that it will be the first time that actually the Jewish Holocaust will get a worldwide exposure, which it did not receive at that time. By the way, most of the research literature that was published until 1960 was about Second World War, not about the Holocaust, although one happened within the framework of the other, but the Holocaust, which I will tell you later on how much is published now, at that time was left out. People were telling about the battles of Second World War, about Pearl Harbor, whatever, name it, but only Second World War from the war aspect of the writing. The third answer for that, I will give you a little bit later, not very late, but I will give you a little bit later. So until 1960, when the trial of Adolf Eichmann started, the prevailing discourse in the Israeli society was the victim's guilt. This is unlike any other country in Europe. If you look, for instance, about the discourse in France, the discourse in France until the late 1980s was that basically every French people, every French man and every French woman was a part of the Maquis. That's the French underground, which is of course completely different from the facts of life. In France, there was a huge wave of collaboration with the Germans, but the French people did not think and speak about that until very late in the 20th century. With the Jewish people, it was all the way around. First, we started blaming ourselves with the death of the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. What was the reason the Germans succeeded in killing so many Jews? The Jews were always weak. They did not have a country of their own. They collaborated. They answered every decree and law the Germans put on them. Basically, it was the Jews of the diaspora who were for 2,000 years like slaves. Whatever the people told them to do, they did. And this was the victim's guilt in its own death. The Eichmann trial starts a whole new discourse and a whole new story. All through the year 1961, the trial went on, and Israel went through what I might call a collective trauma or re-trauma. What I really want to tell you is that by the end of the year, something unprecedented happened. At the end of 1961, the judges published their verdict. And in an unprecedented event, they published before their verdict a preface, which they called the court's ways. Now, I will give you one paragraph from this very long introduction to the verdict. But before I do so, I want to tell you something very interesting. For the public, the only thing that they remembered from the trial was the testimonies, and of course, the day Eichmann was hung and his ashes were scattered in the sea outside of Israel's territorial water. The judges, in their verdict, ignored completely the testimonies. They did not relate to the testimonies, and they related only to documents. And they felt, in a way, that they should alibi themselves for this ignoring of the testimonies, which caused such a big excitement in the Israeli discourse of the public. There was a mix between the public and the judges. So let's see just the end of this court's way. I leave you, of course, with the presentation so you can read everything that is written there. And they say that there were many questions raised at the trial about the Holocaust. And even so, I marked here where I'm going to read to you. All the material is but a tiny fraction of all that is extant on this subject of the Holocaust. According to our legal system, the court is by its very nature passive, for it does not itself initiate the bringing of proof before it. The proof is of the prosecutor, as is the custom with an inquiry commission. Accordingly, its ability to describe general events is inevitably limited. As for questions of principle which are outside the realm of law, no one has made us judges of them, and therefore no greater weight is to be attached to our opinion on them than to that of any person devoting study and thought to these questions. These prefatory remarks do not mean that we are unaware of the great educational value implicit in the very holding of this trial for those who live in Israel, as well as for those beyond the confines of this state. And indeed, they listened all over the world. To this extent, that this result has been achieved in the course of the proceedings, it is to be welcomed. Without a doubt, the testimony given at this trial by survivors of the Holocaust who poured out their hearts as they testified, as they stood in the witness box, will provide valuable material for research workers and historians. But as far as this court is concerned, they are to be regarded as byproducts of the trial and no more than that. So you must bear in mind that the testimonies, which I'm going to speak about now with some illustrations, were of no importance basically to the trial itself from its legal side, but with a very strong importance to the civil discourse. Now, here is a picture from that time. You can see me in comparison to this Booth glass and Eichmann sitting in the glass. Booth, 60 years ago, one is in color, the other is not in color, but it's the same cell. And I will just show you a couple of the people here. The man standing with his hand like this is the prosecutor. His name was Gideon Hausner. Eichmann is the man with the glasses at the glass booth. All the policemen who are watching over him are Oriental Jews, because basically the belief was that there was no Holocaust in North Africa and in the Middle East. And so they don't have a reason to take vengeance on Eichmann for the loss of their families. And the guy who is sitting at the left of the prosecutor, that's his defender, that's Servatius, who came from Germany to defend Adolf Eichmann. Now, you remember we read the opening remarks of Jackson at Nuremberg. Now, let me show you the opening remark of the Eichmann trial. This is also a text that the Israelis remember until today. Not all of them, but many, many Israelis remember until today. And then remember that I want you to think while I read this, what was the Eichmann trial all about? In the place in which I stand before you, judges of Israel, to prosecute Adolf Eichmann, I stand not alone. With me at this moment in time, I'm joined by 6 million prosecutors, but they are unable to rise to their feet, to point an accusing finger at the glass booth and to cry out against the men sitting there, I accuse, because their ashes have settled among the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Yablonka, were wasted by the forests of Poland, and their graves are scattered across the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voices are unheard. I shall therefore be their mouth, and I shall read in their names the terrible bill of indictments. Now, of course, the first answer to the question, what was the Eichmann trial about, is obvious. The Eichmann trial was putting to trial one of the biggest Nazi criminals as far as the Holocaust is concerned, and that's Adolf Eichmann. No matter what Hannah Arendt said about the banality of evil, Eichmann is a very important man in the process, moving towards the final solution. I don't give you a history lesson right now because I don't have the time, but I've been doing so much work on this that I can say that I stand behind my opinion. But the Eichmann trial was another thing. The Eichmann trial was the first manifestation to the Jewish people all over the world, and of course, especially to the Israelis, which at that time numbered 2 million people. Of this, 1 of every 4 Israeli was a survivor of the Holocaust. Can you bear in mind what happened to Israel at that time of the trial, with the testimonies? When 1 of every 4 Israeli is a survivor of the Holocaust, or his children, this is, of course, you can imagine the big trauma, the big collective trauma. But this was the first manifestation for the Jews all over the world, and maybe even to the large world in all, what it means that the Jewish people have a state of their own, because only when they have a state of their own, they can judge those who had harmed them. And this is the third meaning of this will be the Jewish Nuremberg. Because only now that when we have a state, the Shoah will not be a marginal issue when we tell the story of the Second World War and the Jews. So let me introduce to you now to a couple of the testimonies which shaped a new knowledge. Before I do so, I want to say that the Eichmann trial was this point in time for the Israelis as well as to the world, when information was transformed into knowledge. The first testimony I want to introduce to you is Moshe Beisky. Moshe Beisky was a survivor of the Holocaust. Of course, there were 110 witnesses. There was a big argument, by the way, if to bring witnesses or not to bring witnesses. The police didn't want them. The prosecutor wanted them. and eventually he won, and he brought 110 testimonies. Of this, Moshe Beisky was in Plaszów, and he describes, amidst his testimony, he describes a scene where two young boys were trying to escape Plaszów. They were caught, and they were put to hang in an appel at the courtyard of the camp of Plaszów. And one of them was that the rope was torn. And in the world, it's used to think that when a rope is torn, when you're hung, your life is given to you. But this is a German case. And the people of the Jewish people of the camp were, of course, put to view the execution, as you should know what's expected if you try this once again. And the prosecutor suddenly asks Beisky the following question. Remember the victim's guilt. 15,000 people stood there, and opposite them, hundreds of guards. Why didn't you attack them? Why didn't you revolt? Beisky told me, Beisky was the first man I interviewed before I started my book about the Eichmann trial. And he told me I never spoke with Hausner, whom we were friends before the trial, for this question. I could not forgive him for asking me this, but he answered the question. And at the papers the next day, one of the writers, one of the reporters wrote, we should bow our heads in front of this answer. What he said, and I will not read it to you because I'm looking worriedly about the time. What he basically said is, I cannot convey to you what is fear of death. I cannot convey to you what it is, a collective punishment, when what you do yourself may cause the death of other people. And the Germans always did collective punishment. And I cannot convey to you what it means to be in the midst of the war with hope that maybe if we don't do nothing, if we just keep going on, if we just keep trying to keep our lives and watch about them and not do anything, we'll get to live to the end of the war. And then he said the fourth thing, which is very important. He said, listen, in my camp in Plaszów, there were 1,000 Polish people. They had a home to run to. We didn't have no place to run to. None of them escaped. None of them revolted. And it was the first time that somebody put the Jewish behavior during Second World War in perspective of the other nations. Did any other nation revolt? Actually, no. The first urban resistance, revolution against the Germans was the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943. The Polish revolted only later on in 1944, and that was, of course, very late. Basically, when you put an equation and you put the Jewish attitude towards the German, it was no less than the others. In many parts, it was even more graver. This is something which is very important in the next testimony that I want to show you. The next testimony was by Tzivia Lubetkin. Tzivia Lubetkin was one of the leaders of the fighters of the ghetto, of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the establisher of the kibbutz, of which the museum, I am the historian for the last 22 years. And this is, by the way, the first Holocaust museum in the whole world. And I will tell you by the end of my lecture how many museums exist today of the Holocaust. I think it's an event that has the most number of museums all over the world. And she describes what they did in the first 3 years of the ghetto before the actions which sent the transports into Treblinka. The Jewish youth movement, she says, adjusted their work to the new reality. Right from the beginning, when it appeared to us that the German policy was to degrade us, to change us into a nation of slaves, ignorant people lacking culture, we still believed that this was not total destruction. If we thought that these prohibitive laws were intended to wipe up the human image, then our battle was to preserve the human image, to develop a spirit of revolt against these evil decrees. And when I say revolt, I do not refer to a particular rebellion, that means with weapons, but rather to preserve the human, social, and cultural character of the youth. We call all this paragraph in one word. This is education. When do you do education? You do education when you believe that there is a future. And then later on in her testimony, she explains what was this point in time and in events that made them stop the educational program. It was when somebody came from Vilna, Hanna, and told them the testimony of the massive murder of the Vilnius Jews and the fact that the people there believe that this is a total decision to kill all the Jews in Europe. And then they heard many other testimonies from other ghettos. And then they understood that this is not a fraction. This is not an accidental thing. This is a plan, a massive further plan of killing all the Jews of Europe. So if we are doomed to death, there is no point in investing in education. And the same day we heard Henek's testimony, we stopped our educational program. This was the first time the Israelis heard what was the essence of the uprising. The essence of the uprising was basically we can master death only through deciding when we will die and how. And this is the only option that is left to us. So bravery suddenly transformed into many things. Surviving one day in the ghetto was considered to be bravery as well, not only with weapons. You can see here Tzivia, and you can see Antek Zuckerman. Antek was the deputy of Mordechai Anilevich, who was the commander of the ghetto uprising. Almost the last testimony that I want to show you, because of lack of time, was Hansi Brandt. Hansi Brandt was actually one of the only witnesses who met Eichmann in person. And that was the Hungarian kind of a deal of merchandise as reward of saving Jews, which of course never materialized. You know that Hungary is of course one of the big tragedies of Second World War, because it happened by the middle of 1944, when the whole Jewry of Hungary was still alive. Within 6 weeks, Eichmann succeeded in sending more than 500,000 of the Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz and of course to extermination. Hansi Brandt was conducting straight negotiations with Eichmann. And suddenly one of the judges asked her, "Tell me, Mrs. Brandt, when you came into Eichmann's room in Hungary, Budapest, 1944, did you ever think of killing Eichmann?" And she answered, of course, this is a complete anachronism. If she would have killed him, that would be terrible for the Jews. And she said, "I do not wish to blow my own trumpet, nor do I wish to blow the committee's trumpet." It was a committee that they built up for saving and rescuing. "We bore this in mind, what we could achieve. Let us assume that we go in to see him, we are not checked, and one of us shoots him. What would we achieve by that? I must say that frankly and sincerely, we were a committee for aid and rescue of our people, and none of us was a gibor." Gibor is in Hebrew, a hero. She spoke in German, you can see her here. And I will skip now part of Vera Alexander's, but basically at the Eichmann trial, the victim's guilt phase faded away. And suddenly began the discourse of the murderer's guilt. And I can give you the stages of the discourse. And this is not only an Israeli stage, this is also a staging of the world discourse. Victim's guilt, then the murderer's guilt, and then the ongoing discussion of what is most important, the bystander's guilt and the bystander's behavior. The reasonable people like me and you, what we have been doing at that time, which is the big question and the big enigma. Following the trial, the survivors were transformed in their social status. Until the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the survivors were comprehended as new immigrants who immigrated to Israel, and they should, as soon as possible, absorb or assimilate into the Israeli society and be a part of it. This will be best for the rehabilitation and kind of forget the past. Nobody can, of course, forget the past, but let the past be in the past. At the Eichmann trial, it was the first time that the survivors were put back into the context of the Shoah. Suddenly, the Israelis understood that these people, with the numbers tattooed on their arms, are also a part of the Shoah, not only the 6 million who perished. And suddenly, people understood that they have a heritage and a story to tell us. So, and they are part of the national texture of the Israeli society. And by the way, I know of the same process in the American background. Let me tell you, there has been very few research done on the impact of the Eichmann trial all over the world. But in America, there was some research done, and I know that for sure that it's very similar to the process that started also in the United States. Now, one of the reactions which I want to read to you is not Alterman, is this. They and we, they, the survivors, and we, the Israelis who did not survive, are united. We are one people. We could have been there physically instead of them. And had we been there and they here, then they would most certainly have established the Yishuv, that's the way to the state. And the IDF, that's the Israeli army. And if fate had been cruel to us and we were there, our fate would have been the same as theirs. Suddenly, there is no qualitative difference between us and them, the diaspora Jews and us. And our heroism, no less. The differences do not lie within the nation, but in the here and there. Now, I want to end this part by showing you at that time, how this transformation from knowledge, from information to knowledge was expressed by Chaim Guri, who is Israel's most famous laureate poet. We knew these things, didn't we? Yes, we knew. Even before the Eichmann trial, we knew scholars and historians and collectors had engaged in the endless work in Israel and abroad and had given us the documentation, but many people covered their eyes whenever they came near it. There was Yad Vashem, and there was the Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Museum at Kibbutz Lochamei HaGetaot. But when this material was taken to the prosecution table and became part of the indictment, when these documents broke out of the silence of the archives, it was as if they were now speaking for the first time, and this knowledge was very different from that knowledge. This process released tremendous energy of the now I understand. And here comes the new Israel. I'm sorry, I will have to skip this, but I will just give you the shift from knowledge to awareness. After the war of 1973, which was a very, very severe war in which Israel really thought that it's the end of the new state, there was a whole tremendous earthquake in the thinking, in the Israeli thinking. And one of Israel's educational commander, he was the chief education commander, said the following sentence. Look at the bottom of this presentation. The Shoah shapes our national consciousness and the ways by which we understand ourselves and the world in which we live. Let me tell you what is the difference between knowledge and awareness. Knowledge is that you know the event, you comprehend what the event is all about. Awareness is when this event becomes a light by which you understand and appreciate your existential situation and make your own national decisions. The Shoah took place as the central element in the Israeli national identity, not the state, but the Shoah. This is a profound impact of the Eichmann trial time and the time that elapsed after the trial, and it's not such a long time, it's only 13 years after the trial. I just want to give you just one thing, and then I will give you some remarks, general remarks. 2012, Goodman Institute, which is the most famous Israeli institute for public opinion, gives you the following data. 98% of Jewish Israelis believe that to remember the Shoah is the most important principle that should guide the state. This is unbelievable. The Israelis argue about everything. The Jews are a very arguing society as a whole. There is a big story about the 2 last Jews in Afghanistan, in Kabul, who didn't speak to each other, and each one of them had his own synagogue. So 98% of the Jewish people have a consensus about anything. This is unbelievable. And by the way, the Shoah after the Eichmann trial became also the main element of the Jewish identity of the American Jews. And I don't think it's only the Americans, I think it's all over the place. In similar polls, by the way, from the 1960s and the 70s, the state was ranked first. Now you have a key to understand some of the Israelis' fears and anxieties and decisions of today. I would like to end up my presentation with an epilogue. Today, no, this I owe you. In 2002, there was the last convention of survivors of the Holocaust from all over the world. It was convened in Jerusalem. By the end of this conference, the survivors actually published a manifest, a survivors' declaration. On this declaration, we have the signatures of more than 100,000 survivors of the Holocaust. Now, you know that today, 2020, 21, there are almost no more survivors in the world. I have my mother, of course, and there are others, but they number a very small number. And they left us with what they live, what is their message to humanity. This is the declaration for all over the world. I will read to you only the last part. It's a 3-page, you can find it, by the way, in the internet. It's called the Survivors' Declaration, 2002. The Holocaust, I want to make it shorter. The Holocaust, which established the standard for absolute evil, is the universal heritage of all civilized people. The lessons of the Holocaust must form the cultural code for the education towards human values, democracy, human rights, tolerance, and patience, and opposition to racism and totalitarian ideologies. From Har HaZikaron, that's the Memory Mountain in Jerusalem, the words of Rabbi Hillel need to ring out loud and clear. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human being. This is our legacy to the world. This is our legacy to the next generation. And let me give you an epilogue about something in the world which is going on now. I have it here. 60 years after the trial, there are more publications and research done on the Holocaust today than about Second World War. No doubt, the Shoah and the Holocaust is an epoch-changing event, as the philosopher Emil Fackenheim termed, and I believe that it is true. It's a criteria to judge the ultimate evil. It doesn't mean that the world is a better place to live today, but still it's a strong impact. There are over 500 Holocaust museums all over the world. Tell me if you know of another event that has so many museums in the world. There is an International Holocaust Remembrance Day declared by the UN in 2005. Anonymously, all countries of the UN voted for this Remembrance Day. It's on the 27th of January, the day Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians. The moral, ethical discussion over the banality of evil is taking place since Hannah Arendt published her book about the Eichmann trial. I personally am very much opposed to the concept of the banality of evil, but it still is a very strong and important discussion about the essence of evil, which takes place at least once a year somewhere in the world. The term genocide was termed only in 1944, at the beginning of 1944, by Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish refugee from Germany who escaped Europe in 1940 and felt that what is happening in Europe is unlike any other mass killing that happened in history before, and he termed this term genocide. He published his book about genocide in 1944, and this term became one of the most used terms in the world we live in. And what the survivors left us, I just gave you 2 minutes ago, and I'll stop here, and I thank you very much.